Welcome back to another incredible story that proves why you should never judge a book by its cover. Before we begin, drop a comment letting us know where you're watching from today. This tale of humility, arrogance, and an unforgettable lesson took place on a first-class flight from New York to Los Angeles, where a chance encounter would leave one passenger wishing he had kept his mouth shut. Picture this: a luxurious first-class cabin on a transcontinental flight, where the elite of society rub shoulders in leather-bound comfort. Among the usual parade of designer suits and polished shoes, one passenger stood out, not for his flashy appearance, but for his remarkably casual attire. Dressed in worn jeans, a comfortable Henley shirt, and a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes, he carried himself with a quiet confidence that needed no announcement. The late afternoon sun streamed through the airplane windows, casting long shadows across the plush carpet of the first-class lounge. The subtle scent of fresh coffee and expensive cologne mingled in the air as passengers settled into their pre-flight routines. Some tapped away at laptops worth more than a monthly mortgage payment, while others sipped champagne as if it were water. Bradley Whitman had just finished his third glass of premium champagne when he noticed the casually dressed man taking the seat next to him. His perfectly manicured eyebrows furrowed at the sight. As an investment banker who prided himself on his social status, Bradley believed first class was a sanctuary for people of a certain caliber, his caliber. The casual passenger moved with an easy grace, stowing his worn leather bag in the overhead compartment before settling into his seat. He pulled out a dog-eared paperback, the kind you might find in an airport bookstore, and began to read quietly. This simple act seemed to irritate Bradley even more. Emma Sullivan, the lead flight attendant, approached with a warm smile, offering pre-flight drinks. Her experienced eyes took in the scene, recognition flickering across her face as she glanced at the casual passenger, though she maintained her professional composure. Before she could speak, Bradley's voice cut through the cabin's gentle hum. "I suppose they're letting anyone into first class these days," he said loudly enough for nearby passengers to hear, adjusting his Italian silk tie with manicured fingers. "Standards really aren't what they used to be." The casual passenger turned a page in his book, seemingly unaffected by the comment. This only served to fuel Bradley's need to establish his perceived superiority. Thomas Cooper, an elderly businessman seated across the aisle, looked up from his newspaper, his eyes narrowing at Bradley's rudeness. Maria Rodriguez, another first-class passenger, shifted uncomfortably in her seat, second-hand embarrassment coloring her cheeks. Bradley leaned closer to his seatmate, his voice dripping with condescension. "You know, there are other cabins better suited for casual travelers. This section typically caters to a more refined clientele." He gestured to his own tailored suit, as if to illustrate his point. The casual passenger marked his place in his book with deliberate care, turning to face Bradley with calm, weathered eyes that had seen far more of the world than the banker could imagine. There was something familiar about those eyes, something that tugged at the edges of Bradley's memory, but his ego quickly dismissed the thought. "Is that so?" the casual passenger replied, his voice carrying a quiet gravitas that made several nearby passengers look up from their pre-flight activities. The tone was familiar, eerily familiar, like something they'd heard countless times before on the big screen. Emma Sullivan returned, this time with Captain James Mitchell's compliments to the casual passenger. Her eyes sparkled with barely contained amusement as she addressed him, careful to keep his identity private for the moment. "Sir, the captain wanted to thank you for that wonderful performance in the latest Indiana Jones film. He's been a fan since Raiders." The color drained from Bradley's face as realization dawned. The casual passenger removed his cap, running a hand through his signature gray hair, and suddenly the features that had been shadowed became crystal clear. Bradley Whitman had just spent the last several minutes insulting Harrison Ford, one of Hollywood's most beloved and respected actors. The first-class cabin grew quiet as other passengers began to recognize the star in their midst. Thomas Cooper smiled knowingly, having suspected the man's identity from the start. Maria Rodriguez covered her mouth to hide her growing smile at Bradley's predicament. Harrison Ford, ever the professional, simply nodded his thanks to Emma and turned to Bradley with a hint of amusement in his eyes. "You know, I've found that true refinement has very little to do with what you wear or how much money you spend on a tie. It's about how you treat people, all people. Bradley's expensive cologne couldn't mask the scent of his humiliation as he sank deeper into his seat, his earlier bravado evaporating like morning mist. The other passengers tried to hide their smirks behind magazines and tablets, but the atmosphere in the cabin had shifted dramatically. The investment banker, who had been so quick to judge based on appearances, now found himself faced with the reality that he had just insulted a man worth hundreds of millions of dollars, not just in wealth, but in talent, respect, and genuine accomplishment. A man who had earned his place in first class 1,000 times over, yet chose to dress comfortably rather than flaunt his status. Captain Mitchell's voice came over the intercom, welcoming passengers aboard with special mention of their distinguished guest, who had brought joy to millions through his iconic roles. Bradley's face turned an even deeper shade of red as he realized his social faux pas would be the talk of the cabin for the entire 6-hour flight. Emma Sullivan glided through the cabin, serving drinks with practiced ease, but there was an extra warmth in her smile when she attended to Harrison Ford. She had seen many first-class dramas unfold over her years of service, but this one would surely become a story she would tell for years to come. As the plane began its taxi to the runway, Harrison Ford returned to his book, as unruffled as if nothing had happened. His quiet dignity in the face of Bradley's rudeness spoke volumes about his character. Here was a man who had nothing to prove, no ego to defend, and no need to put others down to lift himself up. The lesson wasn't lost on the other passengers. Thomas Cooper nodded approvingly at Ford's handling of the situation, while Maria Rodriguez made a mental note to share this story with her children, a perfect example of why they should never judge people by their appearance. Bradley Whitman spent the remainder of the boarding process staring straight ahead, his jaw clenched, possibly reflecting on how his attempt to assert social dominance had backfired so spectacularly. He had wanted to prove he belonged in first class, but his behavior had demonstrated quite the opposite. The irony was clear to everyone in the cabin. The man in the simple clothes and worn baseball cap had shown more class in his silence than the man in the expensive suit had shown in all his boasting. It was a powerful reminder that true class has nothing to do with the price tag on your clothes or the seat you occupy. It's about the way you carry yourself and treat others. As the plane lifted off into the clouds, leaving New York behind, one thing was certain: Bradley Whitman would think twice before judging another passenger by their appearance. Sometimes the most expensive lessons come free of charge, delivered with the quiet grace of a Hollywood legend who didn't need designer labels to prove his worth. Have you ever encountered someone who judged you by your appearance? How did you handle it? Share your stories in the comments below, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more incredible real-life stories that remind us why we should never judge a book by its cover. The revelation of Harrison Ford's identity was just the beginning of what would become an unforgettable transcontinental flight. As the aircraft climbed to its cruising altitude, the atmosphere in the first-class cabin crackled with an energy that no amount of complimentary champagne could dispel. The other passengers found themselves part of an unfolding drama that would teach everyone aboard a valuable lesson about humility and grace. Bradley Whitman's expensive watch felt increasingly heavy on his wrist as he struggled to find a comfortable position in his seat. Every slight movement seemed to draw attention to his presence, a stark contrast to the easy confidence radiating from his famous seatmate. The investment banker's mind raced with potential ways to salvage his reputation, but each scenario seemed more impossible than the last. The cabin lights dimmed as the plane leveled off at 35,000 feet, the soft glow creating an intimate atmosphere that only heightened the tension. Emma Sullivan moved through the cabin with practiced efficiency, preparing for the first-class meal service. Her knowing glances at Harrison Ford spoke volumes about the countless celebrities she had served over the years, yet there was something different about this particular flight. Thomas Cooper, the elderly businessman who had witnessed the entire exchange, removed his reading glasses and closed his newspaper. He had spent decades in corporate boardrooms, watching men like Bradley Whitman throw their weight around, and he couldn't help but appreciate the cosmic justice unfolding before him. In all his years of flying first class, he had never seen someone so thoroughly humbled by their own prejudices. Maria Rodriguez, meanwhile, had discreetly switched to a seat with a better view of the unfolding situation. As a successful publisher, she had developed a keen eye for compelling narratives, and this one was writing itself. The contrast between Harrison Ford's understated presence and Bradley's desperate attempts to maintain his dignity was something straight out of a best-selling novel. The night sky outside held countless stars, invisible from the ground but brilliant at this altitude. It seemed to mirror the evening's lesson, that true worth, like those stars, was often hidden beneath the surface, waiting to be discovered by those wise enough to look beyond first impressions. As the flight entered its fourth hour, the first-class cabin had settled into a rhythm that felt almost surreal. The initial shock of Bradley Whitman's social faux pas had evolved into something more profound, a masterclass in dignity and redemption playing out at 35,000 feet. The incident that had begun as a simple case of misplaced judgment was now revealing layers of complexity that touched everyone aboard. Emma Sullivan had just finished serving another round of drinks when turbulence rattled the cabin. Harrison Ford steadied Bradley's wobbling glass without comment, a small act of consideration that seemed to finally break through the banker's carefully constructed facade. The simple gesture carried more weight than any verbal response could have conveyed. Thomas Cooper observed the interaction with knowing eyes, reminded of his own journey from arrogant young executive to seasoned businessman. He had learned similar lessons throughout his career, though perhaps none quite as memorable as the one unfolding before him. The elderly gentleman caught Bradley's eye and offered a sympathetic nod, recognizing the internal struggle playing out across the younger man's face. Maria Rodriguez had been quietly taking notes on her tablet, no doubt finding inspiration for her next publishing venture. The story practically wrote itself, a tale of pride, prejudice, and the unexpected wisdom found in a chance encounter at 35,000 feet. She watched as Bradley's rigid posture gradually softened, his expensive suit no longer serving as armor but instead seeming to weigh heavily on his shoulders. Captain James Mitchell's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing they were flying over the heartland of America. The timing seemed almost poetic, a reminder that beneath the trappings of status and success, certain fundamental truths remained constant. The captain shared a brief anecdote about his favorite scene from The Fugitive, another subtle acknowledgement of their famous passenger that served to highlight the evening's lessons. Bradley Whitman cleared his throat, finally finding the courage to address his seatmate directly. "Mr. Ford," he began, his voice lacking its earlier arrogance, "I owe you an apology." The words seemed to cost him something, but they came out genuine and unforced. Harrison Ford turned from his window view, regarding Bradley with the same steady gaze that had captured audiences for decades. "You know," he replied, his voice carrying that familiar gravelly warmth, "in all my years of flying, I've learned that the real measure of a person isn't in how they act when they think they're right, but in how they handle discovering they're wrong." The wisdom of this statement rippled through the cabin. Emma, who had been discreetly polishing glasses nearby, paused in her work. Thomas Cooper nodded appreciatively, while Maria Rodriguez quickly captured the quote on her tablet. The simple truth of Ford's words seemed to touch something universal in everyone who heard them. Bradley found himself sharing the story of his own journey to success, how he had started as a clerk in a small bank, fighting his way up through sheer determination and an almost desperate need to prove himself. As he spoke, the pretense fell away, revealing the insecurities that had driven his earlier behavior. "I spent so much time trying to belong in places like this," he admitted, gesturing to the first-class cabin, "that I forgot what it actually means to deserve being here." The honesty in his voice was palpable, touching a chord with several other passengers who had fought similar battles with their own worth. Harrison Ford listened with the same attention he had shown to Emma earlier, his presence encouraging without being overwhelming. When Bradley finished speaking, Ford shared a story from his early days as a carpenter, before his acting career took off. "I used to build cabinets for people who probably wouldn't let me in their front door today," he recalled with a slight smile. "Every job, every role, every person has dignity, if we're wise enough to see it." Maria Rodriguez couldn't help but draw parallels to the publishing world, where manuscripts in shabby folders sometimes contained more brilliance than the most professionally presented submissions. "We're all guilty of it sometimes," she offered, "judging the book by its cover, even when we know better." Thomas Cooper shared his own story of a pivotal meeting early in his career, where he had been dismissed because of his youth and shabby suit. "I walked out of that meeting determined to never let anyone feel that way in my presence," he said. "Sometimes our worst moments become our best teachers." Emma Sullivan moved through the cabin with fresh towels, adding her perspective as someone who saw humanity at both its best and worst every day. "You'd be surprised how often the kindest passengers are the ones who could afford to be rude," she noted, her experienced eyes taking in the changing dynamic of the cabin. The conversation expanded to include other passengers, each sharing moments when they had either judged too quickly or been judged unfairly. The first-class cabin had transformed into a space of unexpected candor and connection, with Harrison Ford's understated presence serving as a catalyst for genuine reflection. Bradley Whitman listened to each story with growing understanding, his earlier embarrassment gradually giving way to something approaching wisdom. The very qualities he had tried to project through his expensive clothes and condescending manner, confidence, success, belonging, were being demonstrated far more effectively through simple human connection and honest dialogue. As the plane began its gradual descent toward the west coast, the changing light outside the windows painted the cabin in soft golden hues. The timing seemed perfect for Harrison Ford to share a final insight, drawn from decades in an industry known for its emphasis on appearance. "You know what I've found?" he mused, his voice carrying just enough to reach the attentive passengers nearby. "The most valuable things in life, respect, dignity, kindness, don't cost anything. Yet somehow, they're often the hardest to give away." The truth of this observation settled over the cabin like a comfortable blanket. Bradley found himself nodding, understanding for perhaps the first time that his expensive suit and first-class ticket hadn't brought him the respect he sought, but his willingness to acknowledge his mistake and learn from it had earned him something far more valuable. Emma returned to prepare the cabin for landing, her movements efficient but unhurried. She had witnessed countless dramas in this cabin over the years, but few had ended with such a clear demonstration of growth and understanding. The way Harrison Ford had handled the situation would become part of her repertoire of stories, a perfect example of how true class manifested itself. Thomas Cooper began gathering his belongings, pausing to share a final observation with those around him. "In all my years of business," he said, "I've learned that the most successful people are often the ones who remember what it felt like to be on the outside looking in. They're the ones who hold the door open for others instead of slamming it shut." Maria Rodriguez added her own conclusion, drawn from years of publishing human stories. "Sometimes the most powerful stories aren't about grand gestures or dramatic confrontations," she reflected. "They're about the small moments when we choose to be better than our prejudices." As the plane descended through layers of clouds, Bradley Whitman sat quietly, processing the lessons of the past few hours. His initial mistake, judging Harrison Ford by his casual appearance, had led to an evening of unexpected wisdom and genuine connection. The very qualities he had tried to display through external trappings had been demonstrated most powerfully by the man he had attempted to diminish. The Los Angeles skyline appeared through the windows, a glittering reminder of the city where appearance and reality often danced a complex tango. Yet here, in the first-class cabin of a transcontinental flight, a simple truth had emerged. True class had nothing to do with the price of one's clothes or the exclusivity of one's surroundings. It was about the capacity to learn, grow, and treat others with dignity regardless of their appearance or status. The cabin crew began their final preparations for landing, but the atmosphere remained charged with the energy of shared understanding and genuine connection. What had begun as a moment of social awkwardness had transformed into an opportunity for growth and wisdom, touching everyone who had witnessed it. As the aircraft made its final approach into Los Angeles International Airport, the first-class cabin had become something more than just a luxurious travel compartment. It had transformed into a space of profound revelation where a chance encounter between an arrogant investment banker and a Hollywood legend had orchestrated an unforgettable lesson in humility, dignity, and the true meaning of class. The city lights below twinkled like earthbound stars, a fitting backdrop for the final act of this remarkable journey. The fasten seatbelt signs chimed on, but the atmosphere of contemplation remained undisturbed. Bradley Whitman, who had boarded the flight convinced of his superiority, now sat in thoughtful silence, his expensive watch catching the cabin lights as he absently adjusted his collar. Emma Sullivan moved through the cabin one last time, ensuring everything was secured for landing. Her eyes met Harrison Ford's with a shared understanding. They had both witnessed countless human dramas unfold in these confined spaces, but few had reached such a meaningful conclusion. The veteran flight attendant had become not just an observer but a vital part of the evening's transformation. Thomas Cooper folded his newspaper with deliberate care, his experienced eyes taking in the scene before him. In his decades of business travel, he had witnessed the full spectrum of human behavior, but this flight had offered something special, a masterclass in handling conflict with grace and wisdom. The elderly businessman couldn't help but smile at the poetry of it all. Maria Rodriguez finished typing the final notes on her tablet, knowing that this story would resonate with readers in ways that fiction never could. The natural arc of redemption, the unexpected wisdom found in a moment of humiliation, the gentle guidance of an unlikely teacher, it was the kind of narrative that reminded people of their own capacity for growth and change. Captain James Mitchell's voice came over the intercom one final time, announcing their descent into Los Angeles. There was a warmth in his tone that went beyond professional courtesy, a recognition that his flight had hosted something extraordinary. "Mr. Ford," he added, "it's been an honor having you aboard. Your films have brought joy to millions, but your character brings inspiration to everyone fortunate enough to meet you." The comment hung in the air, carrying weight beyond simple celebrity admiration. It spoke to the heart of what everyone in the cabin had witnessed, how true greatness manifested not in displays of wealth or status, but in small acts of kindness and quiet dignity. Bradley Whitman turned to Harrison Ford, finding the courage for one final conversation. "You know," he began, his voice carrying none of its earlier pretense, "I came on this flight thinking I knew exactly what success looked like. I couldn't have been more wrong." Ford's response carried the same understated wisdom that had characterized his entire approach to the evening's events. "Success isn't about proving you belong somewhere," he observed, his gravelly voice gentle but firm. "It's about making sure others feel they belong too." The truth of this statement resonated throughout the cabin. Emma paused in her preparations, recognizing the profound simplicity of the message. Thomas Cooper nodded appreciatively, while Maria Rodriguez captured the quote with quick, practiced movements on her tablet. As the plane descended through the last layer of clouds, Bradley shared a final reflection. "I spent years building this image," he gestured to his expensive suit and accessories, "thinking it would make people respect me. But you showed more class in a baseball cap and worn jeans than I managed with all my designer labels." Harrison Ford's response carried decades of wisdom earned both on and off the screen. "The funny thing about respect," he said, "is that the more desperately you demand it, the less likely you are to receive it. But show respect to others, and it has a way of finding its way back to you." The other passengers listened intently, aware they were witnessing something rare, a moment of genuine transformation. The first-class cabin, often a showcase of wealth and status, had become a classroom for one of life's most valuable lessons. Emma Sullivan began her final service rounds, but there was a different quality to her movements now. The practiced efficiency remained, but there was also a sense of participation in something meaningful. She had seen countless displays of entitlement in her career, but rarely had she witnessed such a complete journey from arrogance to understanding. Thomas Cooper shared a parting observation with those around him. "You know," he said, his voice carrying the weight of experience, "in business, we often talk about return on investment. But the best returns I've ever seen came from investing in human dignity, both others and our own." Maria Rodriguez closed her tablet, but not before adding one final note. "Sometimes," she reflected, "the most powerful stories are the ones that remind us of our common humanity. They're the ones that show us that no matter how high we climb, we're all capable of both mistakes and redemption." The Los Angeles skyline grew clearer through the windows, a glittering testament to a city where appearance and reality often danced a complex duet. Yet here, in the rarefied air of first class, a simpler truth had emerged, that true character revealed itself not in moments of triumph, but in how we handle our mistakes and learn from them. As the landing gear deployed with a reassuring thud, Bradley Whitman sat straighter in his seat. The evening had stripped away his carefully constructed facade, But in its place, he had found something more valuable, a genuine understanding of what it meant to carry oneself with real dignity. Harrison Ford returned his book to his worn leather bag, his movements unhurried and natural. Throughout the flight, he had demonstrated something that no amount of money could buy: the quiet confidence of someone who knew exactly who he was and felt no need to prove it to anyone. The plane touched down smoothly, its wheels kissing the California tarmac as the cabin lights brightened. Emma's voice joined the captain's in thanking passengers for choosing their airline, but there was an extra warmth in her tone, a recognition that this had been no ordinary flight. As the aircraft taxied to its gate, the first-class cabin buzzed with quiet conversation. Passengers who had begun the journey as strangers now shared knowing looks and genuine smiles, bound together by the extraordinary lesson they had witnessed. Bradley Whitman gathered his belongings with a new awareness. His expensive briefcase and designer carry-on suddenly seemed less like status symbols and more like what they really were: just bags, no more capable of conferring real class than his expensive suit had been. Harrison Ford stood with the same easy grace he had displayed throughout the flight, retrieving his worn leather bag from the overhead compartment. As he did so, he offered one final piece of wisdom to those around him. "You know what I've learned in all my years of traveling?" he said, his voice carrying just far enough to reach the attentive passengers. "The journey isn't about reaching a destination, it's about who we become along the way." As passengers began to disembark, Emma Sullivan stood by the cabin door, exchanging genuine farewells with each person who passed. When Bradley reached her, she saw something different in his eyes, a humility and warmth that hadn't been there when he boarded. The Los Angeles terminal waited beyond, its bright lights and busy corridors a world away from the intimate atmosphere of the first-class cabin. But for those who had shared this remarkable journey, something had changed. They had witnessed a powerful reminder that true class had nothing to do with the cabin you sat in or the clothes you wore. It was about how you treated others, especially when no one was watching. As our story comes to a close, we invite you to reflect on your own experiences with judgment and redemption. Have you ever had a moment that changed your perspective on what really matters? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories that remind us of the extraordinary lessons we can learn from ordinary moments. Remember, in a world often obsessed with appearances, the most valuable things, kindness, respect, and dignity, don't cost a thing. They're available to all of us, regardless of what we wear or where we sit. Sometimes, it just takes a humble hero in a baseball cap to remind us of that truth.